Hello, it's Katy from What Katy Stitched, and this is a video tutorial for my free pattern which you can download from the blog, and I'll include a link to that in the comments below. And it's a pattern that's suitable for beginners, great for practicing embroidery skills. It just uses backstitch, and if you're more experienced, it's a really lovely quick project. So to get started, you need to print just page 3 of the pattern, which I've done here, and then this tutorial is going to show you how to make this using tissue paper as a guide. So I've traced round the pattern onto a piece of tissue paper, and then I'll attach that to a piece of felt. So you need 2 small squares of felt that are just big enough to fit your pattern on, and then you just need to attach the tissue paper using pins. I've chosen to use this method because you can't really very easily trace a pattern onto felt, and you could use a water-soluble stabiliser, but I just wanted to make this pattern really as accessible as possible, and that's why I've used the tissue paper. So you'll need some felt and tissue paper, you'll need some scissors, and you'll need a needle, and I've chosen to use a size, I think this is size 5 needle. I tend to use a slightly smaller needle for embroidery normally, but on the felt a slightly bigger needle is better, but if you wanted to use a bigger needle again, then that would be fine. These are embroidery needles. You'll also need some embroidery thread, which normally looks like this, especially if you're going to use the water-soluble stabiliser, i.e. your sewing, your work is going to get wet. I would suggest buying quite a high quality thread such as Anchor or DMC are the two that I use mostly, so that there's less chance of the colour running. I've chosen to use, I think it's called ecru, like a cream, so it hopefully shows up better for you during the video on the purple felt, but you could use any colour at all, or you could use like a variegated thread if you like, so the colour changes throughout the skein of thread, which can look quite nice. You'll also need a small amount of toy stuffing for stuffing your heart together when you're finished. So as I said, this pattern only uses backstitch for the stitching, and what we're going to do is we're going to stitch over the letters using backstitch, and then cut the heart out, sew it together and stuff it. So what I've done is I've started by splitting my 6 strands, because each of the embroidery threads have 6 strands for each piece of thread that you cut. So I've cut a length of thread which isn't too long, it's about from my fingertips to my elbow. If you cut it too long, you'll get into lots of knots. And I've put a knot in the back, on the ends rather, and I'm going to start by doing my back stitch. I think I'm going to start on the tip of the L and work round this way. So it's great because you're only working with a small piece of felt, you can twist it around and hold it whichever way you want, and there isn't a right or wrong way to where you start. On the obviously I'm going to show you now, but on the pattern there is a kind of a step-by-step guide for doing the back stitch. So I'm going to come up and just do the first little lip of the L. And then I'm going to come along this way. So I'm going to come up and then go back down through the same hole that I came down before. And then I'm going to come on a stitch, trying to keep my stitch length as even as possible, so the stitch is similar length, and that will just help your work look a little as neat as possible. But it's not, it doesn't have to be really precise, because no, honestly nobody will notice. So I'm going to keep going around the L, until I've covered all of the lines of stitching. So to carry on doing your back stitch, you're always coming along one stitch and then coming back on yourself to go back down the hole that you went down before. I'll do it a couple more times. So jump on a stitch, then back down the hole that I went down before. Right, so I've done my first L, and I have got enough thread left to do a little bit of the O. So what I'm going to do is carry my thread across, but instead of just coming across with it lying flat on the back of the work, I'm just going to come under the back of my threads just to keep the back a little bit neater, so there are less threads for you to get caught on while you're stitching. Right, so I'm going to start here at the bottom of the O, and then I'm going to carry on round, and then I'll come back when I need to change my thread and show you how I like to fasten the thread off. Right, so I've run out of thread now. I think that's probably a good amount of thread to leave on your needle for finishing off. If you leave it too short, it makes it quite tricky. So similar to when I've come across here before and looped around the back of my work, that's what I'm going to do now to finish this thread off. So I like to do it 2 or 3 times. So loop once, so I'm going between the thread and the felt. I'm not going through the felt. I'm going to do it twice, and then on the 3rd time I'm going to come through, and then I am going to come through my loop before I pull it tight, and then I can pull it tight and it makes a nice little knot. And then you just take your scissors and snip, not too close to the knot, but you don't want to leave a really long thread either. So I'll cut myself another piece of thread, and I'm going to carry on stitching the back stitch, go around all of the lines of all the letters, and I'll come back and show you the next step when I've done that. Right, so I have now sewn around all of my letters, and before I pull this tissue paper off, I'm going to use the outer line of the template as a guide for cutting out the heart. So I'm going to keep these 2 pins here within the line, and I've just moved these 2 slightly so they're outside of the line, and this just stops the outer bit of the paper from moving around. Obviously our stitching is holding the middle bit of the paper in place. You could use any scissors really that are sharp enough to cut through felt. So these are a pair of dressmaking shears, and I'll just follow the line. It's the only time that I would allow my dressmaking or fabric scissors near a piece of paper. If anybody was to try to cut paper with them normally, I'd get really cross. So it works with a big pair of scissors, that's fine for this shape. I quite like these scissors. They're also from Fiskars. They're sprung loaded, so it can make it easier for cutting smaller shapes. And again, with a smaller pair of scissors, it works fine as well. So I'm just following the line all the way around. Until the end. And so before you throw these bits away, obviously remember to take off your pins. And then what we can do now is we can remove the tissue paper, and so pull away from your stitching, try and keep it flat rather than pulling up, and hopefully you'll find that it tears away pretty easily. And then any loose bits we can catch with a pin. Keep going. Obviously, if you've used a soluble stabilizer, at this point you'd put your work in water and then leave it to dry before you go on to the next step. But once we've pulled all these little bits out, we're good to go. On to the next step, cutting our second shape out. So last few bits. So obviously we couldn't use this bit of tissue paper again, so if you wanted to do another one, you just need a new piece of tissue paper. But that leaves our stitching looking pretty nice on the felt, I think. So we take our second piece of felt and we're going to use this, the first one that we cut out as a template. It's really hard to cut two separate things, put them together and for them to fit equally. So hopefully doing it this way we'll end up with, you know, having to trim the shapes a little less. So I'm going to pin quite well. So to stop the felt from moving around, I'm going to pin these two together. And I'm going to use the first one as a guide to cut this one out. So cut all the way around the outside. And you can always save these tiny bits of scraps of felt for other projects. You could cut them out and use them to make flowers and stitch those onto another piece of felt. Or I know my children like snipping things like this up. Right, so we've got two hearts now that are exactly the same size, and we can start sewing our heart together. Before we do that, I'm going to make myself a little hanging loop. You of course don't have to hang this up. It could just be you could pop lavender in it and it could go in a drawer, but I'm going to put a little hanging loop on this, and I've cut a shorter length of the embroidery threads. I'm just going to tie a knot, double it over, put the two ends together and tie a knot there. And then what we want to do is we're just going to attach it in place with a few little stitches. So what I've done here is I've separated my thread this time down into 2 strands, so it's slightly thinner. I'm going to use the contrast of the cream around the edge so that you can see it when you're stitching, but if you wanted to at this point you could absolutely pick a colour that matched so that your stitching disappeared. And I'm going to knot the end of my thread. And then I'm going to go through the very top layer of the felt without going through to the back, so it isn't going to show on the back. I'm going to do just a couple of stitches like that to make sure that my thread's secure, and then I'm just going to go over the top going through just the very top layer of the felt. It isn't going through on the back, so it doesn't show on the back, and that just holds it in place. And so I'll do an extra loop so I can fasten my thread off. Okay, so I'm going to snip that and re-pin. And then I'm going to start sewing up the heart. I'm going to start about here, and then we're going to sew all the way around the edge until you get to, I don't know, 1.5 inches, 2 inches away. And then we'll stuff it and then stitch up the last little bit of the heart. So I'll put a knot back in my thread. When you're sewing up, we're going to use running stitch for sewing the heart up, and when you're I'm going to do 2 knots there, so the knot is slightly bigger. When you're doing running stitch, you will end up with a right side and a wrong side, no matter how many times you stitch this up. However neat you are on the front, this is one of my prototypes, on the back your stitching will always be different. So just be aware of that, and you want to be having your right side, the side that you've embroidered, facing you upwards when you're sewing. So as I said, we're going to start over here, and we're just going to do running stitch around the edge. And I'm going to start by doing the same as I did when we put the hanging loop in, just by doing a little catching a thread there. Now, because we've got 2 strands, what you can do is just do 1 little stitch and then come through between the 2 threads to pull that tight to hold your threads in place. And I like to start by just coming up through the first layer, just above where I've put the knot. Tuck the thread down, the tail rather of your knot, and now we're going to sew around the outside using running stitch. So that's just doing 1 stitch at a time, again trying to keep them fairly even. And instead of coming back on ourselves like we did with the back stitch, you just carry on around the outside. So we're going through both layers of the felt, and you want to pull it tight, so you don't want the edges to be gaping so your stuffing comes out, but you don't want to pull it so tight that you warp the outside edge of your work. And we're going to carry on around the outside. Stitch length is completely up to you, you know, how long or short you want to do it. Just be aware that the longer the stitches are, you might have your stuffing coming out of the edges. So I'm going to carry on sewing as I said, all the way around here until I get to about here, and we'll stop to stuff it up. When I need to change thread, I'll pop back on and show you how I like to do that as well. Right, this is as far as I've got round with my length of thread. You could cut yourself a longer piece of thread if you wanted to see if you can get all the way around, but it's fine to change your thread part way round. So the way that I like to finish the thread off, I could potentially use a bit more of that thread, but I'll show you how to do that now. So I've been taking the pins out as I've gone. Move this one along so it's out of my way a bit. I'm going to come just through the top layer as if I was going to do another stitch. This time though, go through only through the top layer, and then on the back of that layer I'm just going to go through and do a couple of those stitches just through the top layers of the felt. It isn't showing on this side, and then on the last pass through I'll go through my loop, pull it tight, and then knot it, and then cut the tail off, and then I can get my other bit of thread. And then tie my knot. And I'm going to start by just going over this stitch again and carrying on around the rest of the heart. So again, I'll start by catching my thread through the top layer of the felt. I'm going to go through the two threads there, and then I can tuck my tail under, and then I'm going to come back up, redo this stitch, and then carry on through. You don't have to redo the stitch. I tend to do it when my stitches are spaced further apart like this, so I haven't got a gap, you know, a gap there. You could just come up here and carry on around. So let's just finish sewing this heart. Last few stitches. When it comes to a point, you might want to alter the length, or needs to alter the length of your stitch so that you end on the point. I'm going to come up here and finish so we've got enough room to stuff the heart. Right, so I'm going to grab some stuffing. I've been taking the pins out as I've gone, but if you haven't done that, now's the time to take them out and grab your stuffing, and then we're going to fill the heart up through this hole here. Right then, I've got some toy stuffing. This one is made from recycled plastics. You could use, you know, an old pillow inners if you don't have toy stuffing. So I've left my thread on my needle, and I'm just going to take small amounts and I'm going to start by coming up into the top of the heart, using my finger to gently push it through. And this is when you want your stitches to not be too far apart so that your stuffing's not coming out the other side. And up into that corner. It's completely up to you how much, you know, how heavily you stuff the heart. I'm going to come down into that, the bottom corner, and then I'm going to put a little bit more in. For this last one, what we'll have to do is push it away down from the seam while we sew, and then we can plump it up afterwards. A tiny bit more. Right, you can either pin it now, or if the hole is not too big, hold the felt with your fingers, or by all means get a pin to hold it shut if you find it easier, like that. So now we sew the hole up, and so now we'll keep going all the way up to the top. My stitches have got a bit bigger there. I'm excited to get to the end of the project. So last stitch, and then I'm going to come onto the back of my work and do a couple of times just through that top layer, pull it really tight, and then this time I'm going to loop through to make the knot, and then trim the thread and kind of give it a bit of a squeeze around to move the stuffing back out to the outside of the heart, and there it is, a finished heart. Hope you found that useful. I'll include the link to the pattern in the comments below, and if you do make one, I'd love you to tag me on social media where I'm at Katy Stitched, and if you like the video, please like it and subscribe to my channel for more tutorials in the future. Thanks for watching. Bye bye.